I would like to introduce to you Juan Riol Martin, and he is our youngster, or our young star in the row of our presenters. He has an interesting status because he is in the morning in business and in the afternoon at the university. So we call it in Germany a dual student. He studied telecommunications and multimedia and communications, and his bachelor thesis was like his presentation theme of today. And Juan, I would say he is in Accenture Consultancy in Madrid, and he studies at the University Carlos III in Madrid too. And he likes music, especially drums, and he likes sports. It's normal for a young man. It's basketball. So, Juan, I hope the best for your presentation.
Thanks.
And you have the floor now.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for that kind presentation. I also think I'm the youngest person here in the room, so I'll try to do my best. First thing I'd like to say that I'm also speaking on behalf of my professors and tutor with whom I elaborated this studio, Professor Raquel Pérez and Professor Julio Navío. Okay, this is the index of what I'm going to address today. I want to keep it clear that the focus of this study was to evaluate the technical performance of the different 4G and 5G networks versus the deployment cost of these networks. To do so, I'm going to first address some premises and problem statement. I'm afraid that Andy has already gone through all these premises, so thanks Andy for the help, because I'm sure that you have explained it very well, better than I could do. And then I'm going to address this analysis. I'm going to separate it into a technical and economical side to later on quote the results. And last but not least, I will address and talk about some conclusions and the result analysis. Okay, so this picture from Ericsson, I think that it explains very well what 5G is, at least as far as I understand it. We have the core and the radio access network. As for the core, we will have a very strong dependence on software. Therefore, we'll have network function virtualization and software-defined networks. And also, the flexibility, the flexible deployments will be key to address the new core issues. And as for the radio access network, millimeter wave bands and legacy radio access technology, the one coming from 4G LTE systems, will also be very important. As for the requirements, I've extracted this picture from the ITU website. These are pretty much the requirements that were aforementioned. I think that we should pay special attention to the latency, which is going to be a very stringent requirement, and to peak data rate. Keep this in mind because I'm going to go through this later on to do the analysis, but it's not so important to keep all the numbers in your head, but just notice that there will be two phases. We can see in the picture on the right that we will have IMT Advanced and IMT 2020. So we'll just keep in mind that we will have at least two phases. Yes, as I said, 5G will be let's say a process that to be entirely fulfilled by 2020. We'll also have 3 stages, or at least I assume that we will have 3 deployment stages or scenarios. And 4G, or what we call LTE, as for currently we'll have LTE advanced systems, will be key to the deployment of 5G. Okay, so the problem statement. I'm sure you're already familiar with this picture, but we'll just focus that we will have 3 cases of use. The enhanced mobile broadband, the massive machine type communications, what I called massive IoT, and the ultra reliable and low latency communications, which I call mission critical services. So just keep in mind we'll have 3 use cases to analyze. On the other hand, I'm going to talk about deployment scenarios. As long as we have two segments in a network, the core and the radio access network, and we have three options, which are LTE or 4G systems, 5G, or the combination of both, we'll have 12 possibilities, from which I took three feasible scenarios: a starting point, a transitional or middle point, and an ending point. In this picture, we can see the starting point, which is the what we have now, an LTE advanced system with its own able packet core and the radio access network. And in the ending point, I assume that we will have the 4G and 5G systems interworking to optimally address each case of use. As it was mentioned, we are going to have very diverse cases of use, so we will need to optimally use each generation to optimally address from a technical and an economical point of view each case of use. So what about scenario B? Because the scenarios A and C seem very direct or very easy to assume, but there must be a transition between these two scenarios, scenario B. It will be deployed, I would say, more feasibly in 2019, and it must have at least one 5G segment, either the new radio or the core, what has been called the next generation core network. I assume that the new radio will be under development or just self-deployed, not at all, because World Radio Conference, which is being held in 2019, will address this, will target these new bands, these higher millimeter wave bands. So new radio, which includes that bands, will be self-deployed. Sorry. And the next generation core will be deployed, or at least that was the very first assumption from which I will depart. This is the schematical representation of scenario B. New radio that is being self-deployed will in some way assist the LTE radio, but it will not be fully deployed. And then what I did was to make a binding between the IMT phases that were shown in the very first slides with these scenarios. As for IMT Advanced, that has been covered and is being covered with LTE networks, LTE Advanced networks, is bound to a scenario A, and IMT in 2020, what will be 5G, is being covered by scenario C. So just keep in mind that our scenario B is just somewhere in between the other two. Later on, we'll see. Okay, the technical analysis. I'm sure you remember this figure, and I also took from ITU website another picture in which we can see how important will be the 8 key performance indicators for each case of use. What I did was to weight this importance with weights ranking from 1 to 3. And on the other hand, I have the improvements. What I did here was basing and comparing to LT as it was first specified in release 8. I compared the figures of the key performance indicators to obtain how much will each KPI improve. Numbers are not that important, but just keep in mind that on the one hand we have the weights that have been ranked, and on the other hand we have the improvements. So the technical analysis is based on a self-invented unit that we call technical rate, which simply, without deepening too much into the math, is the weight of the KPI for each scenario and for each case of use times the improvement that actual KPI improve. So some insights about there is the importance of the KPI scenario cross, the improvement. It's divided by 24 just to get a normalized number, and this self-invented metric doesn't have any units because I want to keep it very clear that we are just weighting improvements. So there is no units, and all these improvements in terms of gigabytes per second, milliseconds, can be all put together in one formula to address the technical analysis. Okay, so That's pretty clear for scenario A and C, since they are directly related to one IMT stage. But scenario B is not related to any IMT stage, so it's not that clear. What I did here is to make two assumptions. Assuming our self-defined metric technical rate depends equally on the run and the core, or that it depended more on the run, let's say at 65%, and 35% in the core network. I just made up some numbers and some equations which are not that interesting to explain here in that presentation, but it's very interesting to keep in mind that 5G will be heavily influenced by LTE enhancement. At first, it was not very clear if it would be such a disruptive generation to break with all the other generations, but it now seems clear that 4G or LTE systems will be very important to address a pretty wide variety of cases of use for 5G. These are just some mathematical equations, but I'll go quick over them. Okay, so I made up the numbers with the formula that you see in the previous slides, and I came up with this graphic. Depending on the optimistic or pessimistic assumption I made for scenario B, we came up with these graphics. Just to keep in mind some insights that enhanced mobile broadband will be the most demanding case of use in terms of how many KPIs it involves and how important are these KPIs, because we already know that mission critical services, we'll keep in mind this example of the autonomous vehicle, has, for example, less requirements, but it's very sensitive to failure. The requirements are very stringent. So keep in mind these results, because this just is, let's say, half of the photos. This is only a technical analysis. Okay, as for the economic analysis, what I did was to come up with a report from the European Commission in which they had the deployment cost in euros per subscriber of every mobile generation, and they made a linear regression to estimate what would be the cost of 5G. So in this table we can see the information that I've already given, the segments for each scenario, and the cost per subscriber taken from the regressions, because 5G, of course, is just an estimation. And we also know that on a very top-level approach, the cost of any scenario will be the cost associated to the radio access network plus the cost associated to the core network. And this cost may be either enhancing cost for the scenario, for example, or for enhancing the LTE networks, and deploying cost for when we want to deploy the new radio or the next generation core network. Keeping this in mind, and I know these equations are not very pretty, but I just made equation systems. I introduced some new parameters. For example, parameter epsilon tells us that from the money that must be devoted to the RAN, how much will it be for deploying the new radio, or for enhancing the LTE radio. So some mathematical background, I came up with this optimization problem. I just programmed and worked on it a little bit, and I came up with the results that you can see in the table. Pay special attention to this parameter mu that tells us how much more expensive is deploying the new core network than enhancing the LTE network. We see that it's almost 1, which means that enhancing the LTE core network and deploying the new core will be not the same, but it will be not that more expensive. So yeah, some insights. Both cores will cost almost the same. Parameter epsilon that told us that from the money of the RAN, how much would it be to enhance, is high. So in scenario B, we can more or less justify from an economical point of view that the LTE access network will work fairly good for the case of use that will be addressed. Both parts of the network will cost almost the same, but this is just the other half of the photo. So we have addressed the technical part and the economical part. So the last thing we are going to do is to cross all these results to see the commitment. Okay, and these are the core results. Here we have the technical rate, the self-metric that I have been explaining, and on the other hand, we can see here in this axis the aggregated cost. So it's the cost of the RAM plus the cost of the core. Here we have to keep in mind that the less steep slopes mean a better commitment. This means that the technical rate improves more than the cost increment. And only total costs are shown, so we really don't have any data of the KPI improvement versus the network segment dependence. It means that if for example, the latency depending more on the RAN, there is no information. So this is just a very top-level approach to address this topic. And enhanced mobile broadband still has the better commitment for each phase, either for the two feasible transitions, the optimistic assumption I made and the pessimistic one. So that was the end of the analysis, and now I will have the result analysis and conclusions. To do so, I came up with this mobility report from Ericsson, in which we can see the estimated users for every generation for the next years. Remember, please remind that the results that were shown in the previous slides were left in technical rate, which has no units, versus euros per subscriber. So to complete, we are gonna check out how this subscribers amount influence the result. As for this phase, I'm gonna consider LTE subscribers as 5G subscribers. And multiplying the subscriber, we obtain these graphs. And what can we say? Well, again, the less steep slopes will mean a better commitment, no matter, because it doesn't change. But there's a shape change. In general, we have a worse commitment for every case of use and every scenario. Then the second transition becomes better for most cases of use and assumptions. We can see that, especially for the pessimistic assumptions, this line is less steep, so the second transition becomes better because the technical rate will have a higher increment. And then for the first transition, it seems fairly clear that it will be better to deploy or to promote or to invest in those cases of use related to massive IoT. As it was explained, narrowband IoT covers a wide range of these applications because these are sensor networks, smart cities. This information, although it's very important to have it very clear and it's trustworthy, doesn't have any requirement, for example, in terms of latency. So the question, as I was introducing it in the previous slide, is what case of use is more recommendable to address, to invest, to investigate for each scenario. As for enhanced mobile broadband, there are diverse cases of use, and there's a relatively good commitment for both transitions. We must keep in mind that we have let's say the widest case of use, that it covers many applications. As for massive IoT, we have the less demanding applications. We saw that in the technical rate, which was the lowest one, and the less important traffic, at least in terms of latency. And for mission critical services, it's very sensitive to failure and very stringent. Let's all keep in mind the example of the autonomous vehicle. And the mobility and latency KPIs depend mostly on the RAN. As I assume new radio will be fully deployed in scenario C, the last stage, in 2020, it will be best addressed for 2020. So I elaborated, let's say, a recommendation score ranking from 0 to 3, which means how recommendable is to address or to invest in all these three cases of use for each scenario. I came up with this table in which we can see that enhanced mobile broadband is very diverse, as I said. You could address it in any scenario to, let's say, cover some of the applications. Massive IoT will be in terms of in this analysis will be optimally addressed in the scenario A, and mission critical services will be optimally addressed in scenario C. So thanks for your attention. It's been a pleasure.